I wasn't looking for Egyptian hieroglyphs when I started this investigation. I was researching colonial-era surveying records from New South Wales. Specifically, the land classification documents filed between 1895 and 1910, when the Australian government was systematically cataloguing the continent's interior for the purposes of railway expansion. Dry material, bureaucratic, meticulous, the kind of archival work that takes months to produce a single useful paragraph. I was looking for inconsistencies in how certain parcels of land near the Hunter Valley had been surveyed and then quietly reclassified, moved from public record into a category of restricted Crown land with no explanation attached to the transfer. What I found instead stopped me completely. In the surveying notes from 1900, filed by a team operating in the Gosford region of New South Wales, there is a reference, a single brief, almost embarrassed reference, to carved stone walls discovered in a sandstone canyon. The surveyor's notes describe the carvings as of unknown origin and considerable age, and then they move on. No follow-up filed. No archaeological notation. No escalation to the colonial authorities. Just that one sentence, and then silence. I put those surveying notes down and began searching for what should have been there. A formal report, a scientific inquiry, a newspaper article, something. Because if a team of professional surveyors in 1900 discovered carved stone walls of unknown origin in the Australian bush, someone should have followed up. Someone should have documented it. Someone should have made a decision about what those carvings were. Instead, I found that the formal documentation had been suppressed, not dramatically, not with any visible effort, but suppressed in a way that the most important things are always suppressed. Quietly, procedurally, by simply not being recorded at all. And the more I looked, the more the official explanation for what was eventually acknowledged at those canyon walls, the explanation that came decades later, reluctantly, under pressure, began to collapse. The site is known today as the Gosford Glyphs, located in the Brisbane Water National Park, New South Wales, approximately 90 kilometers north of Sydney. The carvings occupy two sandstone walls in a narrow canyon, each wall roughly 15 meters long and between 2 and 3 meters high. The glyphs are incised directly into the stone, not painted, not scratched superficially, but carved with consistent depth and deliberate tool pressure, and they number in the hundreds. By the most careful modern counts, there are approximately 300 individual carved symbols across both walls. Here is what those symbols are. They are Egyptian hieroglyphs, not vague, abstract marks that resemble hieroglyphs if you tilt your head at the right angle, not weathering patterns, not Aboriginal rock art of any known tradition. Egyptian hieroglyphs, the same logographic writing system developed along the Nile Valley, codified over thousands of years, used by an ancient civilization that existed on the other side of the planet from Australia. When the site first entered documented academic discussion in the 1970s, because remember, the 1,900 surveying notes were not followed up, and the site existed in a kind of administrative limbo for 7 decades, the initial photographs taken by researchers Ray Johnson and Alan Dash were striking in a specific and technical way. The grain of the sandstone around the incisions showed deep weathering, not the shallow weathering of recent carving, not the surface oxidation of a hoax perpetrated in living memory. The weathering patterns in those photographs, and I have studied them at length, suggest exposure to the elements across a significant span of time. Johnson and Dash, working without institutional backing, produced a translation. Their work indicated that the glyphs described the death and burial in a foreign land an ancient Egyptian named Nefertari, son of Pharaoh, who had voyaged far from Egypt and died in what the inscription called the Great Southern Land. The official response to this translation was swift and dismissive. The New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, along with the relevant Department of Egyptology at Australian universities, issued statements describing the glyphs as an elaborate hoax, most likely carved in the early 20th century by someone with a passing knowledge of Egyptian script. The explanation offered was that a local figure, possibly a stonemason with an interest in amateur archaeology, had produced the carvings as a kind of eccentric tribute or artistic project. I want to examine that explanation carefully, because it is the explanation that will be repeated to you if you raise this subject in any academic setting, and it deserves to be taken seriously before it is challenged. For the hoax theory to hold, you need a stonemason or a team of stonemasons working in a remote sandstone canyon near Gosford sometime around 1900, who possessed not only a working knowledge of Middle Egyptian hieroglyphic script, but also an understanding of specific grammatical constructions, determinatives, and royal titulary conventions that were not fully understood by Western Egyptologists until the late 19th century at the earliest. You need this person to have access to scholarly publications that were largely confined to European academic institutions. You need them to carve 300 individual symbols with consistent depth and stylistic coherence across 15-meter walls. And then you need them to do all of this anonymously, without telling anyone, without leaving any record of the project, without any local tradition or oral history that attaches a name or a story to the creation of the carvings. Furthermore, the tool marks. The specific profile of the incision channels in the Gosford sandstone does not match the tool technology available to a stonemason working around 1900. The cross-section of the carved grooves, studied in detail by independent researchers, shows a profile consistent with stone or copper implements rather than the steel chisels that would have been the standard working tool of a colonial-era craftsman. The marks suggest something older. The shadows fell correctly when the walls were examined in afternoon light. The grain matched the weathering timeline of the surrounding stone face. The physical evidence alone raises questions that the hoax explanation cannot comfortably answer. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now here's where the investigation becomes something larger than a single canyon in New South Wales. Because the Gosford glyphs are not unique. What I mean by that is not simply that other ancient inscriptions exist in the world. Of course they do. What I mean is that there is a specific and recurring pattern of ancient Egyptian or Egyptian-adjacent architectural and inscriptional evidence appearing in locations that have no conventional historical connection to Egypt. And this pattern repeats with unsettling precision across the globe, concentrated in a particular band of discovery dates that runs from roughly 1880 to 1920. In 1909, the Arizona Gazette published a report on an expedition led by a Smithsonian-affiliated researcher named G. Kincaid into the Grand Canyon, where a series of chambers carved into the canyon walls were described as containing Egyptian-style artifacts, statues, tablets, urns, at a depth that suggested extraordinary age. The chambers, the report stated, were accessed via a narrow entrance that opened onto a corridor extending approximately 900 meters into the canyon wall. The measurements were specific. The dimensions of the main chamber were given as approximately 30 by 12 meters, with a ceiling height of 5.5 meters. The artifacts, according to the report, were transported to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. Ask the Smithsonian about this today. They will tell you no such expedition occurred, and no such artifacts exist in their collection. In the same period, accounts emerged from South Australia, not from the canyon system near Gosford, but from separate locations in the interior, of stone structures with carved exterior surfaces that bore symbols comparable to pre-dynastic Egyptian pictographic writing. These accounts appeared in colonial newspapers and were then ignored. The structures, to the extent they can be located at all today, have been reclassified as natural geological formations. In Russia, in the archives of the Imperial Geographic Society in St. Petersburg, there are survey documents from the 1880s describing carved stone chambers in the Siberian interior near the Lena River basin. The carvings described in those surveys share specific design elements, particularly the use of nested oval cartouche-like frames around central symbols, with the Gosford glyphs and with ancient Egyptian royal inscription conventions. The survey documents are real. The follow-up expeditions that should have been dispatched never appear in the record. In Buenos Aires, the Museo Etnográfico maintains a collection of stone tablets recovered from sites in northern Argentina during the 1890s. The tablets carry symbols that independent researchers have compared to both ancient Egyptian and Proto-Sinaitic scripts. The museum's official classification for these tablets is origin uncertain, pre-Columbian, function unknown. In Delhi, the Archaeological Survey of India holds records from colonial-era excavations in Rajasthan that describe underground chamber complexes with carved stone interiors. The chambers have been dated by thermoluminescence analysis to periods that predate the accepted timeline of contact between the Indian subcontinent and the ancient Near East. The analyses were conducted, the results were filed, and then the sites were closed. The pattern repeats across St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, Delhi, the American Southwest, and the Australian bush. The same carved chambers, the same symbolic vocabulary, the same geographical concentration of discovery between 1880 and 1920, the same institutional silence afterward. Who were they built for? In the cartographic archives of European imperial powers, and I have examined facsimiles of these documents extensively, there's a territory marked on maps from the 17th and 18th centuries that covers an enormous portion of the Eurasian continent. It appears on Dutch maps, French maps, British maps, Russian maps. It is labeled in various spellings as Tartaria, not a legend, not a myth, not a vague cultural designation applied by ignorant cartographers to lands they hadn't visited. Tartaria appears on the maps of the world's most sophisticated imperial geographic institutions with defined borders, internal subdivisions named cities, and trade routes. On the 1806 edition of John Pinkerton's Modern Atlas, one of the most prestigious geographic reference works of its era, Tartaria occupies a territory extending from the eastern edges of Russia to the Pacific coast, encompassing what we now call Central Asia, Siberia, Mongolia, and parts of northern China. The territory is immense. By any measure, it would have been one of the largest political entities on Earth. And then, in the space of a generation, it disappears from the maps entirely, not conquered in any war that left a triumphant victor's record, not renamed in any process that left administrative continuity, not absorbed by a neighboring power in any treaty that was formally signed and deposited in the archives of European chancelleries. Simply erased. The maps change. The name disappears. The territory is redistributed among other designations, and the geographic and administrative reality that Tartaria represented is simply no longer discussed. Now consider the timeline of the Hieroglyphs investigation and the parallel discoveries in Argentina, in the American Southwest, in Siberia. Every one of these sites falls within territory that was, at some point before its institutional erasure, within the sphere of what the maps called Tartaria or its adjacent civilizational zones. Every one of these carved stone sites shares architectural and symbolic vocabulary that cannot be fully explained by the civilizations we are told existed in those regions. Every one of these sites produces evidence that was discovered, documented briefly, and then administratively buried in the same period, 1880 to 1920, that corresponds precisely to the final consolidation of the current world order following what I believe was a catastrophic civilizational reset. The connection between the Hieroglyphs and Tartaria becomes impossible to ignore when you examine it not as a coincidence of location, but as evidence of a single, global, pre-existing civilizational network, one that crossed oceans, shared symbolic systems, and built in stone that was not conquered or absorbed, but erased from institutional memory with remarkable thoroughness. The documentary record around the Hieroglyphs and its parallel discoveries is fragmentary in a way that is itself revealing, not randomly fragmentary, the way historical record become fragmentary through fire, flood, and neglect. Fragmentary in a specific pattern. The early report exists, the initial accounts are there, and then the follow-up documentation stops. The Sydney Morning Herald, 1902, a brief notice in the notices section, describes a report submitted to the Colonial Office by surveying teams working in the Gosford hinterland regarding anomalous stone markings of apparent antiquity discovered in a sandstone escarpment. The notice indicates that the report has been received and will be referred to the appropriate scholarly authorities. No further coverage follows. The Australian Town and Country Journal, 1906. A correspondent writing under initials identifies a series of carved stone formations near the Hunter River Valley as bearing symbols reminiscent of Oriental or Egyptian origin, and requests that the colonial scientific establishment dispatch a qualified researcher to examine them. The letter is printed. No response from any institution appears in subsequent issues. The Arizona Gazette, April 5, 1909. This is a full Kincaid report, not a notice, not a brief item, but a substantial front-page account of an expedition into the Grand Canyon that describes Egyptian-style chambers with dimensions, artifact inventories, and the names of Smithsonian researchers involved. The report is specific enough, detailed enough, and attributed clearly enough that it cannot be dismissed as rumor. It appears once in full and is never followed up. The Smithsonian's response, when the report was raised with them decades later, was that no record of any such expedition exists in their institutional archive. The Brisbane Courier, 1911. A short notice describes a request submitted to the Queensland Museum by a private citizen who claimed to have discovered carved stones in the interior bearing Egyptian-style pictographic symbols. The museum's response, printed in the same issue, describes the symbols as likely natural weathering formations misidentified by an untrained observer. The citizen's name is given. The location is not. The Sydney Mail, 1914. A longer feature article describes the findings of an independent researcher who has spent 3 years documenting carved stone sites across New South Wales and South Australia. The article is illustrated. The researcher is named. The article promises a second installment with detailed photographic evidence. The second installment never appears. After 1920, the pattern changes completely. The reports stop. The newspaper stopped publishing accounts of anomalous stone discoveries. The independent researchers stopped producing documented findings. The institutional channels that had been, however reluctantly, receiving and acknowledging these reports simply close. What had been a thin but consistent thread of documentation running through the first 2 decades of the 20th century simply ends, not tapers, not gradually diminishes, but stops. The photographs stop. The reports stop. The maps change. And the Smithsonian, which appears in multiple threads of this documentation as the institution to which evidence was directed, maintains to this day that its collection contains nothing that would require revision of the accepted narrative of ancient human movement and contact. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the Egyptian hieroglyphs at Gosford, the carved chambers in the Grand Canyon, the Siberian survey records, the South American tablets, what if these are not evidence of ancient Egyptian contact voyages in a conventional sense? What if they are not proof that Egyptian sailors crossed the Pacific or the Indian Ocean in dynastic times and carved commemorative inscriptions in remote canyons? That interpretation, while it has been advanced by various researchers, carries its own set of problems. What I am suggesting is something different and, I think, more disturbing. What if there was a global civilizational network, pre-existing the civilizations we are taught, operating across the geographic boundaries we consider natural, that share a common symbolic and architectural language, that build in similar ways across multiple continents, and that was functionally erased from institutional memory sometime in the 18th or 19th century? Not destroyed physically. The stone remains, the carvings remain, the chambers remain, but erased from the record, reclassified as natural formations or obvious hoaxes, stripped of their institutional documentation, and placed beyond the reach of serious scholarly inquiry. Why would such an erasure be organized? Consider the logic. If a globally connected civilization of significant technological and cultural sophistication existed before the world, as we currently understand it was constituted, then the foundational narratives of every modern nation-state, every claim to indigenous origin, every assertion of civilizational priority, every territorial claim rooted in historical presence, would require complete revision. The entire framework by which the modern world distributed land, resources, and political authority after the colonial period will be rendered illegitimate. Is it really so difficult to imagine that the institutions which benefited from that distribution, the Smithsonian, the Imperial Geographic Societies, the colonial archaeological establishments, would have a structural incentive to ensure the evidence of a prior world was classified, archived without access, or simply declared fraudulent? The Gosford glyphs are not a curiosity. They are not an eccentric puzzle for amateur archaeologists. They are, if the evidence points where I believe it points, a fragment of a much larger erased archive, one that was carved in stone precisely because stone survives, and one that has survived despite everything that has been done to ensure it was never taken seriously. There is a specific texture to the institutional response when you attempt to raise these questions through legitimate channels. I want to describe it carefully, because it is often misread as evidence of conspiracy of active, coordinated suppression, and I do not think that is quite what it is. When researchers in the 1970s and 1980s began formally publishing work on the Gosford glyphs, the response from Australian academic Egyptology was not engagement. It was not debate. It was not a point-by-point rebuttal of the translation methodology or the tool mark analysis. It was dismissal, brief, complete, and accompanied by a refusal to examine the evidence directly. The scholars who declared the glyphs fraudulent, in almost every case, did not visit the site. They did not commission independent analysis of the weathering patterns. They did not engage with the technical arguments about the grammatical sophistication of the inscription. They issued statements. They don't debate. They pretend it never existed. This is not, I want to be careful here, evidence of a secret committee meeting in a panel room somewhere to coordinate the suppression of the truth. What it suggests is something more mundane and, in a way, more troubling. It suggests that the academic and institutional frameworks through which we validate historical knowledge are structured in a way that makes certain categories of evidence simply inadmissible, not because they've been examined and found wanting, but because examining them would require questioning foundational assumptions on which entire disciplines rest. When you attempt to raise the Gosford glyphs in an academic context, and I have spoken with researchers who have done precisely this, the response follows a consistent pattern across disciplines and across countries. In Australia, the respondent invokes the colonial hoax theory. In America, the Smithsonian silence on the Grand Canyon chambers is treated as institutional verdict rather than institutional evasion. In Russia, the Siberian survey records are classified as having been superseded by more recent and more rigorous surveys. In each case, the mechanism is the same. It's not active suppression. It's passive erasure. And the weight of that passive erasure accumulates across disciplines, across countries, across centuries into the evidence. The physical, carved, measurable, photographable evidence exists in a kind of documentary vacuum. The stone remains. The photographs remain. The surveying notes remain. But the institutional framework that would allow them to be taken seriously has been quietly and consistently withdrawn. What does it mean when the scientific establishment's response to physical evidence is not analysis, but silence? What does it tell us about the structures through which we are permitted to understand the past? There is one more category of evidence that I want to bring into this investigation before I close, because it connects the Gosford site to a pattern of physical anomaly that extends beyond the inscriptions themselves. In the canyon system surrounding the Gosford glyphs, researchers conducting ground surveys in the late 20th century documented something that the official site assessments had either missed or declined to report. Beneath the canyon floor, at a depth accessible in several locations where erosion had opened the substrate, there are traces of prepared stone surface. Not the natural sandstone bedrock, but a laid stone pavement, the individual elements of which measure approximately 45 by 30 centimeters and show evidence of deliberate shaping. The pavement extends, based on the survey documentation I have reviewed, for at least 20 meters in one direction before it passes under intact canyon floor and becomes inaccessible without excavation. 45 by 30 centimeters. That measurement matters. It corresponds closely, not identically but closely, to a standard unit of measure that appears in ancient Egyptian construction documentation, a module used in the layout of temple forecourts and processional ways. The correspondence was noted by independent researchers and has been ignored by every institutional body with authority over the site. The tools required to produce a prepared stone pavement of that regularity, the survey instruments, the cutting implements, the leveling apparatus, represent a level construction organization that is difficult to attribute to a small group of colonial-era hoaxers working in a remote canyon for purposes no one has ever satisfactorily explained. When you examine the auction catalogs from the period, the 1890s estate sales, the colonial-era tool inventories held in New South Wales archive collections, the equipment that would have been needed to produce that pavement simply does not appear in the hands of private individuals operating in the Gosford region. The museum labels attached to the few tools recovered from the canyon vicinity describe them as agricultural implements, origin uncertain. The catalogs are dismissive in the same way that every piece of documentation in this chain is dismissive, briefly, completely, without engagement. And when you place the pavement evidence alongside the hieroglyphic inscriptions, alongside the weathering analysis, alongside the tool mark profiles, alongside the 1900 surveying notes, and their single reluctant sentence, suddenly the carved pavement beneath the New South Wales canyon floor isn't an anomaly anymore. It's confirmation. I started this investigation in a surveying archive, looking for discrepancies in land classification records. I found a sentence, one sentence, about carved stone walls of unknown origin, and I followed it for months through documents that did not want to be followed, through institutional silences that were louder than any statement, through the spaces between official records where the most important things tend to live. I don't have definitive answers. I want to be honest about that. Only questions. Why would a colonial surveying team in 1900 encounter carved stone walls in a sandstone canyon, note them in a single sentence, and file no follow-up report, unless someone, somewhere in the administrative chain, made the decision that no follow-up report was wanted? Why would the same pattern of discovery, Egyptian or Egyptian-adjacent inscriptions and chambers, found in locations with no conventional historical connection to Egypt, documented briefly in local newspapers, and then never followed up, repeat with such consistency across Australia, North America, South America, and Siberia in the same 40-year window? Why would the Smithsonian Institution, an organization whose institutional mandate is the preservation and study of historical evidence, maintain a complete and categorical silence about expedition reports that appeared under its own researchers' names in American newspapers in 1909? Why would the New South Wales government reclassify land containing the Gosford Glyph site as restricted Crown land? And why would that reclassification happen before any formal archaeological assessment of the site had been completed? Why does every thread of this investigation, every surveying note, every newspaper report, every auction catalog, every museum label, share the same texture of reluctant acknowledgement followed by complete institutional withdrawal? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies pattern, a pattern so consistent across disciplines and continents and centuries that it requires an explanation, and the explanation the institutions offer, hoax, misidentification, coincidence, does not survive contact with the physical evidence. I think we have forgotten something, not in the way that history is normally forgotten, through the accumulation of time and the erosion of memory. We have forgotten it because someone at some point made the decision that remembering was more dangerous than forgetting, that whatever the Gosford glyphs represent, whatever civilizational network carved them, prepared the stone beneath them, and chose that canyon on the other side of the world from Egypt to record a death in a foreign land, was a story too large and too disruptive to be permitted to enter the official record of human history. The glyphs are still there. The prepared stone pavement is still there beneath the canyon floor. The sandstone walls still hold the carved hieroglyphs of a name, Nefertari, and a journey and a death, an inscription that was never supposed to survive long enough for anyone to ask what it means. It has survived anyway,